All right, so what I'd like to do now is welcome to the stage our founder, our CEO, Daniel Chilcott.
Morning, everyone. That's got to be the most complicated Wi-Fi QR I've ever seen. I'd love to know what data is encoded into it. One thing with ChatGPT, everyone kind of agrees it's changed the world, but it's changed things for me in a way that I didn't expect. And one of them is it's made me extraordinarily self-conscious about my choice of verbs and adjectives. But I want to promise you that ChatGPT did not come up with the word embark. That was me. So what we're going to talk about today is how you can go about beginning to craft an integration action plan, a game plan for success within your organization. And before we start on that, I want to back up a little bit and just tell you, if you're not familiar with Flowgear, about the space that we play in and what it is that we actually do. So what is app integration? Well, simply put, it's a way of connecting different apps and services, not just within your own organization, but also with third parties, the apps that you use or the connections that you need upstream to your suppliers, downstream to customers, and then also laterally to partners. It's not obvious when you're starting out in business and you have a small organization why it might be necessary to have a decent integration strategy in place. So what happens if you don't have it? And you may be experiencing some of these symptoms without actually being cognizant of it. The most obvious side effect is just a delayed turnaround in processing information. For example, you have an e-commerce site that you stood up, customers place orders in that site, and somehow those orders need to become invoices inside the ERP. If you don't have someone automating that process, it's a manual process, it's error-prone, so there's an effect on customer satisfaction due to errors and that type of thing. Over time, though, as your org grows and you scale to not just single-digit apps, but tens, and in large organizations, hundreds of different apps, there exists a natural siloing effect where there's a huge amount of overlapping data that is not synced across those different apps. So when your finance team looks at a view of a customer, they see something very different to what the sales team looks at. Now, of course, the sales team wants to see different information. They want to see a history of previous interactions. The finance team is more concerned with the finance. But the fact that you don't have that information visible across both of those apps limits what those respective teams are able to do. And that kind of leads into the biggest and most pernicious problem if you don't have an integration strategy, which is effectively poor decision-making, not only at the department level, but at the organization level. So what Flowgear seeks to do is go beyond just a few kind of quick fix point A to point B syncs and kind of solving the immediate problems. What we're looking to do is form part of your vision for an organization that is integrated across all of the apps and services and allows your entire org to achieve cohesion regardless of its size. So you may be a little further along than some of the examples I just gave a description of. You've moved beyond hand capture. The next kind of default tactical step would be to just create some script-driven solutions. Maybe your IT manager has cobbled some things together. There could be PowerShell scripts or some Bash scripts or other kinds of scripts. It might be a software outsource where you've had some custom integrations, just point-to-point integrations put together. And those serve your purposes for a time. The problem with them is that they tend to be super tactical, so they deal with just the most obvious issues that you need to have resolved. But because they're not designed to be stable and resilient over time, they're prone to brittleness. For example, you build that ERP sync, but you upgrade your ERP, you don't have an integration catalog, so you don't realize that upgrading the ERP is going to have a cascading effect on the integration. That breaks, you don't have the logging, it doesn't show you that there's a problem. You find out a week later when there's some delay, maybe orders are being delayed as a result of that. So kind of the next step up, moving out of that scenario, is to go with the citizen integrator tools. These are very powerful tools, and there's certainly one reason that they're so powerful is because their access is highly democratized, because you don't need a particularly technical skill set to be able to use them. Gartner refers to them as citizen integrator tools for that reason. You're a citizen rather than a technical user. So these tools are very easy to get in with, but they tend to be very kind of linear integration. So, when action occurs in product A, take action in product B. And they can become very inflexible. It's very hard to express nuanced business logic in them. And the other thing that happens is generally they're consumption-based pricing, so they'll be very inexpensive to deploy initially, but because you're paying for every transaction that you integrate, those costs can start to really ratchet up. And actually, the more successfully you deploy those integrations, the more that they start to cost you. And we've seen many cases where those tools actually reach pricing that's on par with full-blown integration platforms. So in terms of where we fit, this is what we call the integration continuum. And what this is that there's an acknowledgement that there's no one-size-fits-all products. Instead, there are different sizes of businesses and different needs that businesses have. But on that far left extreme are the citizen integrated tools. As I said, super high ease of use, very accessible by folks without a technical background, but the trade-off is that the level of sophistication of what you're going to be able to build is somewhat capped. Then on the far other extreme end would be the traditional ESB, or Enterprise Service Bus, still very widely used in large enterprise. The issues with that are that you're going to have to deploy your own infrastructure. You as a customer or your partner are going to be responsible for patching and high availability and so on. And generally, the technical skill set that's required to deploy these solutions is very high. And in most cases, because these tools predate the kind of raft of like no and low code tooling, generally these tools are going to be very heavily script driven. So in a lot of respects, it's more like a software development exercise. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it does mean that it's, that skill set needs to be there. Flogear fits somewhere in the middle there, where we're trying to find a good trade-off between the level of ease of use and the sophistication of what you can build. So we try not to be too opinionated around the workflow design. We'll allow you to use any of a number of architectures. You choose which one you're using, but it is visual design, and so the accessibility of it is significantly higher. Just another word on other iPaaS platforms. This is the category that we belong to. This, again, is a Gartner term, Integration Platform as a Service. Many of the other platforms in the space we've seen go after the enterprise space. So Flogear is somewhat unique in that we're kind of a mid-market and up-positioned product, and we think we offer good value in that space. So I want to talk about two things. One is tell you a little bit about our platform and why we think it's a good option for you to consider. And then second, I'd like to give you some practical tips around how you can get started building your integration strategy. So under Flogear Platform, we're going to talk about 5 things. We're going to look at different connectors that are available. We're going to talk about the low-code, no-code design experience. We'll look at lifecycle management, which is how do you move beyond kind of this high cadence ability to build and iterate on integrations, and how do you kind of stabilize that and make it reliable and appropriately controlled from a governance perspective over time. We'll talk a little about our unique commercial model, and then I'll make just some brief comments around security and governance. And we do have more detailed topics later this afternoon to cover that in more detail. So our platform has about 200 connectors available today. We split these into 2 categories. One is what we call our product connectors, and you see some of them on screen there. So these wrap popular apps and services, and we will generally surface sample information for these products directly from within the console. You're going to see this in the demo that's coming up next, where you'll be able to just drop a connector onto the design canvas and then load up an example of the type of interaction that you're trying to perform, like creating a customer or querying an order, for example. Then the other 100 connectors are what we call technology connectors, and these deal with open standards and services. So for example, the ability to query a generic, like a SQL database, work with things like FTP, different file systems, email, and then generic connectors for things like REST and SOAP APIs or just basic web calls. We're adding to the connectors all the time, and in addition, we're able to create custom connectors, and you as a customer or a partner are also able to contribute your own connectors. We have a breakout on that topic later this afternoon. That's going to be in the breakout room, which will be partitioned off on my right, your left, a little later today. From a design experience perspective, my background as a technical founder is I'm very wary of third-party tools. So I'm going to try to do my best on convince you around my philosophy around what we've done here. A lot of developers tend to push back on visual tooling, and we think there's an appropriate place for visual tooling. First of all, it lowers the barrier to entry so that folks who don't have the same level of skill are able to do things. And then secondly, there are some things that are actually very well suited to visual tooling. And we think that integration workflows is one good example of that. So it's a design paradigm where you're able to sequence these steps together. That workflow design is a good intuitive description of what the workflow is intended to do and reduces the level of technical expertise. I will say as well that we do offer fallback options. So as I mentioned, you can build your own connectors. You can put arbitrary scripts inside the platform as well. And you can call out to things that you've built that exist outside of the platform. So if you need to use it more in an orchestration context, it supports that, but kind of the default mode is visual, and that's how we drive a high cadence design experience. Then drilling into the design, at the one level, we've got the individual steps of the workflow that's going to execute. And then we've got one very special kind of adapter or transformer that sits on the design, which is our visual data mapper. And in Flowgear, it's a product called QuickMap. And what this allows you to do is look at your source data, your source schema, and your target schema, and express how you want to map from source to target. So you're doing kind of field and container level mappings. And then there's an expressive language or function language to control how those fields need to be changed or mutated into what the target requires. So this is just a kind of a conceptual view of what that looks like. We'll get to some of that in the demo as well, so you can see it in more detail. And we've really put a huge amount of work into making QuickMap very powerful. One deliberate decision that we took was using functions that are based on Microsoft Excel. And again, that just kind of increases the level of accessibility. So if you understand how to use a left function in Excel, you're going to be fairly comfortable with QuickMap right out the gate. So those are two of the areas that we try and accelerate the initial design experience. You can kind of drop some things on, you can run it, you can see the results very quickly. But over time, it's actually more important that you move slow rather than fast. And this kind of leads into what we call lifecycle management, where just like in software, software has a SDLC, software development lifecycle. Just like that, integration works the same way. You need to be able to move quickly early on so that you can iterate and get to a design that is appropriate for your requirements. And then once something has shipped and it's in production, you actually need to slow down and make it harder to make changes, because the impact to doing that if you get something wrong is obviously going to be high. Now, there's several reasons for integrations to change, and some of them perhaps aren't obvious on the surface. One is that you might just have a business policy change. It might be that you've changed how your warehouse is working, so there are different ways that that data needs to be integrated. Maybe there's different rules on how specific fields are mapped. And this kind of ties into why having an integration catalog is really important, because then you can look at a product like your WMS and say, well, what does that affect? Well, I've got these integrations that are tied to it, and therefore these are the things that I need to revise as well. Companies routinely onboard and offboard systems, especially as you become a larger org. And I think one of the strengths of the cloud is it's allowed virtually every business to adopt far more apps and services than before, because there's a SaaS app out there for every single niche business. And so kind of the rate of churn of the apps and services within your business is far higher than previously. And then, of course, there are perhaps more obvious things like there might be changes to the vendor's API necessitating a change in the integration, or there's been an acquisition or a merger and you want to consolidate your central IT. So roughly put, these are the stages in that integration lifecycle we talk about. So in the early stages, at the kind of prototype stage, very important that you can move quickly. The team's going to show you some of what that looks like in the live demo just now. Once you've built out an initial design, and from an implementation perspective, you're pretty sure you've got to what you need, it's time to go through a review process. So we support you with the ability to QA changes, and where you need to, you can separate who is building from the people who are doing that QA, so it's a proper kind of separation of roles there. After that, the platform will allow you to push changes into production. We virtualize all of that for you, so you don't have to kind of pick up assets and move them to a special place. It'll handle all of that for you. Post go live, it's going to surface metrics. What kind of level of activity is happening on these integrations? What's the throughput, the raw kind of resources? How many transactions are succeeding and failing? And then what remediations do you need to change, or do you need to take when there are failures? And then following that, you're going to kind of start looping back again by going into that extend cycle. So perhaps you've identified new features you want to build, you want to improve the performance, maybe there's another product that you want to tie into, you want to change some of the business logic. You're going to be able to start at that prototyping stage again. But importantly, you're going to be able to work on the designs, a copy of the designs that are in prod, safely in a dev test area, and kind of repeat that cycle with no risk to anything in production changing until you're ready and have completed that cycle again. So when it comes to commercials, there's a lot of stuff out there. If you've done a bit of research around the integration platform as a service space, the thing to understand about integration is that it's unusually sticky. I would say it's pretty much as sticky as your ERP. That's something that you don't change easily. There are probably other systems of engagement that you're okay to change fairly easily. The product that your team uses to send marketing messages probably ties into 2 or 3 other systems, but could be switched out with another product relatively easily. By contrast, ERP, kind of everything terminates there. It's kind of the anchor tenant, right? And integration is similar, because if you've adopted an integration vision and it's been successful, it's going to be connecting in a whole lot of different ways. So you need to do your homework up front and make sure that you've picked the right platform that you want to invest in, because it's going to be a long-term investment. Also, take some time to estimate what your future consumption might look like. So you might start with 10 solutions. What does 5 years from now look like? And that kind of feeds into the metrics that the vendor is offering. You want to make sure that if your consumption ramps because of your success, then you're not kind of penalized on that from a commercial perspective. So most platforms in the space offer a couple of different commercial options. Generally, as a customer, you want to choose an option that is easier for you to predict instead of one that the vendor understands and it's hard for you to understand. So if I say to you that we price based on the number of CPU cores you need, it's extremely difficult for you to know, based on the things that you want to get built, how many CPU cores that requires. And similarly, it might be easy for you to understand how many transactions you want to sync per month now, but it's very hard for you to predict that out the gate. So generally, models that are tethered to those metrics are going to be unfavorable for customers. Easier ones are cases where specific connectors need to be licensed. Yes, you might adopt future products that you haven't initially licensed, but you're making those decisions very consciously at that point in time. And then probably about the best model, we think, is commercials that are based on the number of integrations that you have within the platform. And different vendors define this differently, but we work on a model called active workflows, which is to say that on all of our plans, you can build any number of integrations. You also have access to all of the connectors that we have available. And your plan only has a control on the number of integrations that are going to run concurrently at a point in time. So what's nice about that is you can choose to run a large number of things in parallel and max out your active workflows, or you can choose to run a large number of things serially and keep your active workflow count low. So as a customer, you have a lot of control over what exactly that ratio looks like, and you are in control of when you change those priorities, based on when you need more throughput and so on. So let's talk very briefly around just some principles around security and governance. We do have a bit more detail around this closer to the end of the day. I think with all of the kind of high-level breaches that have happened over the past decade, customers are pretty savvy these days around understanding the risks around data and risk of that data getting into the wrong hands or being leaked or a malicious actor breaking in. And so we saw, particularly in South Africa, there was a lag in uptake of cloud services, and one of the key reasons was, what about my data? How do I trust the vendor in this regard? So probably a good first step here is Flowgear offers a cloud service that's based in South Africa. We use the Azure data center in South Africa, and so we're able to give you a guarantee of compliance with respect to things like POPIA. And then another thing that we do is we create dedicated infrastructure for every customer. And this is unusual for the place that we play in. Most platforms in this space will go multi-tenant, and that is to say that they create a whole bunch of servers in a cluster, and they load balance workload onto those servers, but you're sitting right next to other customers. And that's okay for some use cases, but it does mean that if there's a vulnerability in one customer, they can potentially use that to break across into another customer. So we've taken the view that both the storage, where we store things like the workflow designs and your sensitive connection credentials, as well as the virtual machines that run your workload, they're all created dedicated for each and every customer, even on our smallest plans. And aside from the extremely high level of isolation that offers, it also enables us to do a lot of things that you're not usually going to see in the mid-market space. We can give you a huge amount of customization around how your company network breaks into the Flowgear network. We can give you a lot of visibility into what's happening with the resources that we're managing on your behalf, like your storage. We can allow you to apply various policies. So from a compliance perspective, you're able to tick all the boxes that you need there. What we also offer is a single sign-on, so every customer gets the ability to log in with either a Microsoft ID or a Google ID. What's nice about that, say in a Microsoft context, is you're essentially authenticated against your Entra previously Active Directory. And so you can lock down access policy there. You can control which users have access into the platform, completely independent of Flowgear. You obviously have an immutable audit trail of previous logins, and then you can create all sorts of other policy, like restrict access by geo and time of day and role and so on. And all of that is independent of Flowgear. So identity is a very complex topic. It's a product in its own right, and so for that reason, we just rely on those identity providers. We also give you an audit trail, so anytime there's activity that's taken place in the platform, someone changed a connection, someone enabled a workflow, for example, you have an audit trail of that you can export as part of your corporate governance process, and then you can configure security groups as well. And we have a lot of guidance that we offer around where we store credentials and what options are available to you for the most secure way to store the tokens and passwords for the services that you need to integrate with. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an understanding of the kind of key benefits around the platform. And what I want to do now is pivot over to just thinking about getting started around building your integration plan. So, half of success is the platform, but the other half really is how you handle implementing solutions on top of that platform. The first decision to make is going to be, am I going to build this myself, or do I want to go with an outsource? I'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about how you can get started if you've never had a cohesive strategy in place before. How do you actually go from 0 to 1 on that and make some meaningful progress? I'll give you some tips for prioritizing which integrations to start with and specifying requirements. And then we'll talk about some remediation of errors and what the cycle around this looks like. As I mentioned earlier, you'll kind of have a V1 that's delivered, and then how you kind of iterate that as you have new requirements coming in future. So broadly, there are essentially 3 ways to look at implementing. If you are a technology business or you have technical folks on staff, you might want to consider a self-serve option. I would not recommend that if you have some IT support, but they're already stretched thin on everything that they're currently doing, because they're probably not going to have the bandwidth to really get into the platform and give you meaningful value. On the other extreme, you've got the outsource option. You saw many of the gold and silver sponsors that we have here today are Flowgear partners. Please go and have a chat with them at the stands today. They'll be able to tell you about solutions that they've built, and we can strongly back them. We've seen many successes with each of them. And then there's kind of a happy middle ground around this as well, which is a co-build. We find a lot of customers really like this. There's a lot of kind of anxiety getting into this. You don't know the platform. You haven't seen any success out of it yet. So what we find a lot of customers do is their first project is an outsource, and then they use those designs, those solutions as a piggyback to kind of level up their own team. So you can certify on the platform, but then when you have a reference design of something that's already in play, it's much easier to start building and iterating, and you start with small features and then progress to more complex projects. So that can be a good first option if you're not sure where you fit in there. So one thing to do is not start with just the pain points. You might have some very urgent integrations that you need to get done, and that's why you're looking at a platform. I grant you that. But if you have any time at all, it's far better to start by building a catalog. And there's kind of 2 aspects to that. The first thing that you want to do is really just document all of the apps and services that are in use within the organization. So what are the different types of objects that you're dealing with, and how do those map to apps? So how many different apps have say, customer data? It's your CRM, it's your ERP, maybe several others. And you want to look at all the different types of data sets and figure that out. Once you've mapped that to the apps, catalog that in a document. A simplistic example of that would be something like this. So what does the source application look like? What's the target? What data set do we need to get moved? Does it need to run in real time? Does it happen once a month as part of a finance month-end process? And then try and ascribe some kind of priority to it. The best is to build the whole catalog first, so a listing of all of the apps that you have, which departments use them, what their functions are, and then layered on that the kind of idealized state of all of the integrations that you might want. Try and get all of that built out first before you try and work on the priority, because the priority is the hard one. And if you've done it right, there will always be more requirements than you're intending to build at any given point in time. So here are some suggestions for figuring out what the priority around those should look like. First of all, consider what is high impact. This could mean a few different things. It could mean operational delays because there's no integration in place. It could be that you have an existing process that's very error prone, and therefore it's really bad for customer happiness. Then look at other solutions that already exist. So if you've got an integration that was built as a hand code and it's already in play, it's probably offering some value. That should give you a signal as to whether it's priority. No one wants to do mundane stuff. So I mentioned that order capture before. People would far rather work on something that requires them to apply thought to a process, maybe a lower volume. So if you can automate 90% of the order sync and the folks in that department are left dealing with the 10%, and they now have capacity to do other things as well, that's quite desirable. And then I previously spoke about processes that are error-prone or complex. Another important point here is that you generally aren't going to aim for literally 0 errors. What you want to try and do is get to kind of 90 to 99% success rate. And the things that fall through the edge cases, sometimes it's not worth trying to specify that kind of long tail of edge cases. It's okay for people to still deal with that manually because you still had the huge benefit of the 90+% being automated. One starting point that is seriously underestimated is sometimes there's an unexpected amount of effort just to get a connection successfully set up in a platform. And so one thing that we encourage customers to do is to start that process really early. You don't even have to figure out what you're going to build. Just try and build a connection that works successfully in the platform before you even start to build any integrations. And the nice thing with this is that can happen before any of your requirements and scoping work has started. There's a couple reasons that this can take unexpectedly long. It can be hard from a technical perspective to get the routing in to the endpoint you're connecting to. You might discover that you don't have the right licensing to be able to talk to that API. You might discover that the feature that you wanted to use to integrate doesn't exist. Or you might discover that you actually don't even have a test environment, and building that out is going to be really hard. A new server's got to get provisioned, whatever the case might be. So it's very useful to start the process of attempting to create a connection that can test successfully very early on. And then generally, trying to build out a full detailed set of requirements out the gate is difficult. So start with just a kind of scrappy process. A good way to kind of kickstart that, mentally starting to reason through what you need to get built is just to grab screen grabs out of different apps. So to go to that example of the e-commerce ERP sync, pull a screen grab out of Shopify of the order sitting there and the equivalent one sitting in the ERP. And this will very quickly start to help you think through what are the field mappings, what process is going through someone's head when they're manually taking those steps. Don't be afraid to think through the difficult problems. You don't need to have the answers to them, but the earlier you can flush out a complicated edge case, the less it's going to cost you later on. And the most significant contributor to project overruns, both in budget and time, are edge cases that weren't anticipated early. So, at an early stage, if you run workshops and you have folks on the ground are often most cognizant of these things, take those notes and use that to inform how involved this integration is going to be. It doesn't mean that you're going to account for each of these. It just means that they're identified as a risk or a scenario that's going to be a problem. And leading into that, it is okay to not have a 0% failure rate. If you design for 0, your cost tends toward infinity. So decide what is going to be acceptable based on the volume and throughputs that you need to achieve. Very quickly, you want to categorize errors in kind of 3 different ways. There are going to be some errors that sort themselves out for customers on hold. As soon as they've taken off credit hold, that order will sync through. You've got a manual fallback for cases that you have pre-understood are not going to be synced because there's some complex legacy business rule that, no new customers follow this process, but these 3 old ones do. So accept that there's going to be a manual fallback. That should obviously be documented. And then finally, if your own team isn't able to resolve something, that's going to get escalated to your implementation partner or ultimately to your integration vendor like Flowgear. And then finally, but beyond the go live, what you want to have is a cadence at which you review these integrations. This could be quarterly, it could be as infrequently as annually, but take a step through that app catalog. Things are going to be changing and in a constant state of flux. It doesn't mean that that review necessitates changes to the integrations, but it's a way to ensure that you're on track and that your model that you have of the apps and the integrations that are in play is still accurate. So we've looked at two things. I've given you a bit of an introduction to the Flowgear platform and then given you some tips around getting started on building an integration strategy and dealing with that implementation. Thank you.